Welcome to this webinar about AML Comfort Letters. For those who haven't met me, I'm Linda Hellström, the founder of GRC Watch. You both have worked with very large transfer agents like RBC and also very large asset managers like Schroders, Franklin Templeton, and BlackRock. And I think you both have a great perspective and knowledge about the differences that we have seen in the approach on KYC when it comes to transfer agents versus asset managers. In our network of financial institutions, we've heard comments from, for instance, distributors and intermediaries who have said that the AML Comfort Letter is getting longer and longer. They see clauses which are very broad, and sometimes it's hard to understand how will you apply these clauses in practice, and if it's hard to understand, does it have any value? And also some of the clauses are even considered to be in conflict with national laws.
Yes, there are many different types of AML letters depending actually who's requesting them from who. You have traditionally the transfer agents who ask for an AML letter on behalf of the fund to an asset manager or to a distributor. You have the regulator like the CSSF who ask for an AML letter to the entity it supervises to get confirmation regarding specific practices. And by the way, when you just mentioned that recently we saw a strong increase in the demand of AML letters, I was reminded that back in February 2020, actually, the CSSF asked the industry, the fund industry, to provide a commitment letter to them, confirming that everyone performs enhanced due diligence on distributors, even if normally only a standard due diligence would be sufficient. So this kind of regulatory pressure from Luxembourg, because we are an international marketplace and we get our main business is abroad, the CSSF decided that AML is one of the key risks for the Luxembourg marketplace, reason why the companies located here should perform enhanced due diligence on the distribution channels of their funds. But you have also, for instance, dealer brokers who ask investment fund managers to provide AML letters. And you can have other people who have meaningful means to ask for an AML letter. I think what's interesting is that an AML letter usually is perceived like a formality. I send you the paper, you can unblock my accounts. An AML letter should be more seen like a commitment. If you sign an AML letter, you commit to something.
Many times they are too broad, and you have mentioned that you should really first analyze the information you have and be specific about what am I missing or what am I not sure about, and then maybe rather ask follow-up questions in some cases and really use the AML comfort letters in the right cases.
The challenge is to gather the right information upfront so that you meet your own objective. And if nobody is clear about what it is doing to achieve which purpose, of course, it will end up with different results, different outcomes, which are going to be more or less relevant and helpful. Because you can have a different distributor with a different role. Distributor as an introducer, as a delegate, as a correspondent when they play a respondent, but you are going to have different business model, execution, placement of financial instrument, advice, a mix of everything. That means you need to get back to the context about the relationship and what it means for you. In my life, the people I talk more are the sales people because they are the entry point for that. They know the relationship, they do the work with them, is to understand what the kind of relationship they are looking at with a counterparty. The landscape, and unfortunately, is not going to be a one-fits-all situation because the landscape is large. You may end up with an intermediary which is only executing transaction for an institutional client with whom you have a relationship. So talking about AML letter with some formalism maybe is a waste of time because you know what is behind. But maybe there are things that you need to have in mind. if there are relationship factors of the underlying of the intermediary in a higher risk country with higher type of client. By law, it creates a nexus with the intermediary for which you need to do some hand-on due diligence. Hand-on due diligence doesn't mean you need to know everything, but you need to know a bit more to make sure that you are satisfied and you know what is going on.
We have already provided the extensive Wolfsberg questionnaire, and then we have filled out maybe another questionnaire with AML questions like the one we have in GRC Watch. Why do we have to send an additional AML comfort letter? What is missing in the Wolfsberg questionnaire, and what is good and bad with that document? Maybe you can comment a bit about that, Frank.
Yeah, with pleasure. The more documents you have, the more you're compliant. Some people do compliance by weight, so the weight's the amount of paper they collected, the more you have, the more you comply. But back to reality. If you go for a simple AML letter, you obviously ask the counterparty to provide you certain commitments on the actual AML processes they apply on the investors, on their clients. They introduce to you, they send to you on whose behalf they place orders. That's why you ask for a specific AML letter. The Wolfsberg questionnaire is also a very good document. It's quite broad. It gives a very broad description of what your AML process is. But for instance, if you take the Wolfsberg questionnaire of a systemic bank, like RBC, like Citibank, you may find information which may be worrying for you. For instance, they may say in the Wolfsberg questionnaire that they accept to deal with weapon dealers, with cash-intensive business, etc. Obviously, they perform EDD, but you may wonder, that's not my client base. And so you're uncertain now. Do these intermediaries send me this kind of client or don't they? So the Wolfsberg may actually open up far more questions than you had initially. And that's why the AML letter is more kind of a confirmation of what is really taking place in your business relationship. And so usually we find in the first part of the letter a quite common wording around which AML processes are applied by the intermediary, distributor, transfer agent, asset manager on its clients. But then what you can do, what you should do, is actually ask the person who writes the AML letter to confirm, A, they know your risk appetite, and they will not send you any other customer than those which are in line with your risk appetite. And also, and that is a new CSSF recommendation, they wrote down in their sub-sector risk assessment they perform in investment funds, the recommendation is to also insert a clause into that AML letter for that actually the entity issuing the letter confirms the kind of underlying investors they have up and when you ask them. So you can get from time to time this information which Jerome mentioned before. Initially, you don't know what you should know. So by having this letter, you have actually created a contractual basis whereby the counterparty commits to provide this information upon request. Again, we stay high level at typology level. We don't speak about breaching banking secrecy rules, for instance, and asking to provide now all little details about the underlying investor. That is not the purpose. The purpose is simply there to ensure that the counterparty, you understand what they do, who their clients are, and upon request, you can get more information about the typology. As mentioned, Jerome, be it from a geographical perspective, do you have clients from high-risk regions, or be it from their proper nature, do you have higher risk investor types like maybe trusts, etc.?
One of the comments or clauses that we have seen is if you see any suspicious activity related to our funds or these funds, you have to report it. Jerome, if you could comment a bit about the signatory normally finds it difficult to sign up on such a broad obligation. Is there a legal basis for this kind of clause from Luxembourgish actors? And how could you phrase that in a different way so that both parties can agree on it?
Yeah, I would say that I don't see always a legal basis to that, and that's usually a situation where I would feel uncomfortable. I myself responsible for AML and have a duty to be the decider, for example, of if something is suspicious. And actually, within my organization or the previous organization I work for, yeah, I was responsible for that vis-à-vis my fellow conducting officer, vis-à-vis the board, but the authorities, but not really the rest of the world. And that's really a question of the relationship that is in place. I find it questionable when we are talking about introduction or a correspondent relationship that a party should report to the other one but in a mandatory manner about suspicious activity. I don't see a legal basis, which is quite different from sometimes a cooperation if transaction, if financial flow doesn't flow through the intermediary. Yeah, it may be helpful to, if you have an information about a suspicion that there is cooperation to say, hang on a minute, be careful if there is a dividend or this kind of things to be paid or a redemption. But if you have the monetary flow in hands and you have clear segregation, I find it debatable.
Frank, do you have any comments about this, how to get around this kind of blocker if one party wants this kind of clause and the other can't really sign up on it?
Yeah, you just remind the situation actually, Linda, where you have the transfer agent telling to the foreign bank, if you do not sign my letter, I will block your account. Usually that's kind of situation that happens, and which is not very diplomatic, by the way, and not always the right way to go down. But as a matter of fact, as Jerome explained, sometimes there is no legal basis to ask a counterparty to inform you in case they've identified a suspicious transaction. Sometimes because their national law doesn't permit it, or simply because the authorities even wouldn't permit it. So if you want to use some wording in the letter to kind of ensure that you are not getting money which they know is linked to money laundering, then you can write it down like this, write into the letter that you want the other party to confirm that they will not send you funds or other types of assets they know are linked to money laundering. You know, what is it worth legally? I'm not sure very much, but at least you have it on paper and you can argue. Initially, we agreed you wouldn't do it, and at least like this, you have something in your hands to cover. And I think the other topic also coming up very often are sanction screenings. You need to inform us if an underlying investor is on a sanction list. And again, here as well, if you look into the European legal framework about economic sanctions, and we read it several times because I didn't believe it initially myself, but actually you cannot share information on somebody who's sanctioned among your clients with another professional. It is not foreseen by European law. They only foresee a vertical escalation, i.e. if you have identified somebody who is a potential sanctioned person, then you need to escalate it straight to your financial authorities, and then they can coordinate with other European authorities if needed, whatever action they have to coordinate. But there is no obligation among professionals to inform each other if you identify that an underlying investor is subject to economic sanctions. If you think about it, within Europe, every human being is subject to European law, be it now a company as well, or be it a physical person, but we all must comply with these EU sanctions. Whether you regulate or not, it applies to you full stop. On the other side, what do you do with your distributors, with your business partners outside the EU? What do you do with them? And all you can do, for instance, is in your AML letter write that in terms of your risk appetite, you do not want them to introduce your clients who are on these economic sanctions lists. So you can do it in this way, as opposed to ask them to freeze assets, because outside EU, they cannot freeze any assets. If Article 3 refers then obviously to Article 323 of the AML law, and the AML actually states that in case of a cross-border correspondent banking relationship or similar relationship, you have to perform EDD. And the question is already, what is a cross-border relationship? In all European countries except Luxembourg, cross-border is a relation between a European institution, i.e. an EEA institution, and an institution outside from a third member state. Sorry, from a third country, not a member state. But in Luxembourg, it's different. Luxembourg considers any European country as being a cross-border, kind of relationship. So if you have a business relationship with a bank based in France, it's already a cross-border relationship. And so the question then is it possible that you ask this bank to perform EDD in line with the Luxembourg requirements in the French market? Honestly, we don't know. So
that's a good answer.
We don't know. So when you have the powers in your contractual relationship, i.e. of a distributor, and you can agree in writing him to do it, it works. But you only use usually an AML letter when you have no contractual relationship, because the underlying investor chooses the intermediary by which he has a relationship with you. And then in this case, then it's a matter of negotiation. And I have to admit, it's one of the gray areas in our European system. And I wonder now, with the 6th AML regulation, which will come, in the single rule book, what they will decide, if everyone has to treat every EU country as a cross-border relationship, or if Luxembourg will give up. I don't think so that Luxembourg would change its mind, but it's a very, very good point, and there is no straight answer, unfortunately, to it. Maybe, Jerome, you have a different view than me.
No, unfortunately, I share the same pain and view.
But the question is excellent.
So the conclusion is, a mutual template is tough in some situations when you don't have an agreement with the counterparty. Then it makes more sense to have more clauses in the AML Comfort Letter, but always make sure not to just send it automatically. First, analyze what you have. You have made some great examples of how to get around like tricky wordings, and the conclusion regarding the obligation to report suspicious activities was more or less that there is no clear legal basis for that, but there are ways to get around it and find some kind of wording, and that you should always try to point out your risk appetite, show what type of investors you want to have. So did I miss anything in my summary now? Or
maybe we should speak again about bad practices, but I think it's important just to highlight it's a very bad practice to force a counterparty to accept a wording you propose them. Because the purpose of the letter is not to obtain by all means, including blackmailing sometimes, a positive statement. The idea of the letter is to get a clear view on the reality, and that both parties agree on the reality. And if that reality is something you don't like, then you need to maybe speak about it with your senior management and agree if maybe you have to change your risk appetite. But it's never a solution to force a counterparty to accept the wording if the reality is, as a matter of fact, different from what you want them to confirm to you. So it's better to negotiate, identify the real differences, work out common solutions if possible, otherwise report it back to your management and look for potential different solution, different risk appetite.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Jerome, maybe you can comment about one struggle that we have heard from distributors and intermediaries is that they cannot use, when they are sending an AML Comfort Letter to, for instance, a legal entity within a transfer agent group, they have to create so many different versions of the AML Comfort Letter. And just why can't you use the same letter to a larger extent in relation to more legal entities?
Yeah. Well, let's go back to the principle. If you have entity A sending a comfort letter to entity B, each of the entity is subject to its own professional secrecy of affairs. So you may have the secrecy of affairs, and if you take in Luxembourg, refer back to Article 505 or 6 from the Penal Code. And on the top of that, or let's say, a waiver to add, if you are subject to the law of 93 as a PSF, you would have the Article 41. So that's where you have that kind of framework to say, normally, I can't share my information because that's part of my secrecy of affair. So the way to one way to overcome it is to say that as an as a distributor, for example, if I deal with one transfer agent, whatever it is, as issue a letter, if it makes sense for all the population which is there, to say to whom it concerns. Because in that case, the transfer agent would be able to use that information across its client base without breaching the professional secrecy between client of a transfer agent.
I guess the risk is that then in many cases it becomes too broad, but if you would have such a general AML letter to whom it may concern, I would just guess that in most cases it would not be accepted. Would I be wrong, or do you think that it would be accepted?
I think it should be accepted because it's the only way to make it to take the representation from the company. It's a commitment of what they do, which they share. You know, in fact, it's not if you dig up with more detail, you are not going to ask a company to provide its own procedure for on your template or etc. to be able to fit. It's the entity making a representation to the external world, and in that case, to whom it may concern, makes sense from that point of view.
Yeah, that's good. And Frank, do you have any comment about that, reducing the number of versions?
Yes, obviously.
That's good.
No, there are some very good AML letters actually with very good representations inside. Like, for instance, one of them is to provide typology of underlying investors, you know, to whoever asks for it. Not again the names and identities of the underlying clients, but just information about it. So there are some good letters on the market which can really bring added value. I think the key is that those who receive the letter don't just look at it, it's whoever, and put it into the box. The reason we're together today, Linda, is that initially there was a Luxembourg conference where somebody, the staff of the regulator, questioned actually the kind of legal weight of AML letters. And when we then went back and asked the person, are you sure that from a CSSF perspective, you would not kind of recognize these AML letters? The answer was, it's not about the fact that they would accept it or not. What they don't like is when professionals receive AML letters and then just classify them in the file by saying, I did my job, without actually analysis, without questioning, without asking themselves, is what I received now really in line with the risk appetite of the client I represent, or with my own risk appetite, actually.
That's a really good point. I mean, we have concluded that rather be specific about what you are missing and that you can show that you have actually analyzed the information you have received. It makes sense to have an AML comfort letter. In many cases, there are many good examples, especially when you don't have an agreement.
About can AML letters include confirmations around AML checks on employees? I love this one. So this one is a very nice one because we have in Luxembourg this, we introduced already very early, back in 2013 in the CSSF regulation, Chapter 2, this obligation to verify the identity of the signatories, especially on banks. And everyone was unhappy that as a bank employee, now you have to provide your personal ID card to a counterparty. And so very long time we discussed measures. And finally, in 2020, CSSF accepted to change their regulation, i.e. to introduce a new option, which was that if the counterparty confirms that they have performed AML KYC on their employees, i.e. signatories, then you would not have to obtain their identification documents. So yes, you can ask this kind of question. It's absolutely right. We always recommend, nonetheless, like you did it here in the question, to specify the context, the signatories, and then usually it works pretty well. So yes, it's an acceptable. And by the way, an AML letter doesn't need to have 20 points. The CSSF, for instance, themselves, they also ask for commitment letters, which is an AML commitment letter, and you can have it really specific on just 1, 2, or 3 points. You don't need to ask necessarily every time, you know, every question. You can really focus it on the areas where you have a doubt, on the areas in which you wish to get a confirmation or a commitment.
That's a really good point. How long are AML letters valid? Do you see a practice there, or do you have a recommendation, Jerome or Frank?
Yeah, it's come back to the level of risk and the categorization of risk, and that's part of one of the other challenge. That's for another good afternoon on that one. But if you know, the practice is usually if you classify things as high, it's a yearly basis. If it is a medium, it's 3 or low. But it's come back to that kind of classification. Maybe yearly is not the appropriate timeline. It may be longer. And it may also be subject to how the relationship and the activity of the intermediary has evolved over time. And that's part of the identification of other trigger events, which put back into question, do we know what we know? And we don't know what we don't know.
Exactly. And like we said in the beginning, in some cases, the wording in the AML letter is like a substitute for the agreement, and you don't renegotiate and sign a new agreement every year either. So I guess it depends. Is a comfort letter and a legal opinion the same thing, or what is the main difference between them?
Oh, it's a very good question. So the comfort letter, or let's call it even commitment letter, is really a letter whereby the professional issuing it confirms or even commits to what he's stating in the letter. So legal opinion is usually an assessment of the legal framework, identifying which are the legal obligations of the professional. So sometimes you have differences between legal obligations and the practice. And also sometimes you want to know, for the type of clients they send you, you really want to know what kind of checks are you performing. Hence, you would ask for the AML letter. So it's not exactly the same. One is issued by the issuer himself. The other legal opinion comes from a lawyer. One is generic on a legal framework. AML letter is specific regarding the company who's issuing the letter. And I think there's another good question. I just see it. I mean, there are many good questions. We could go on for an hour. But I think let's just go quickly through them. I mean, is an expectation from CSSF to test the AML letter by performing spot checks on underlying client? Good question. Yeah, yes. There are a couple of things with the CSSF, but you know, there are 4 pillars in AML. You have the organization, internal organization, and you have the due diligence, appointment of a compliance officer. And the 4th pillar is obviously the checking. So you should do some testing, but again, the testing should be risk-based. And again, we come back to the question of banking secrecy, etc. So banking secrecy is something very special because it seems it's not the same for everyone in every jurisdiction. I'll give an example, Taiwan. For a very long time, we in Luxembourg always argued, oh, Taiwan, strong banking secrecy, we can't get the documentation. But some get the documentation. So when you do your tests, the question is sometimes in more sensitive jurisdictions where the strong banking secrecy and where your risk assessment indicates you should go and test, to actually go on-site and test. Like this, you kind of preserve banking secrecy rules. There are other instances where contractually it's already agreed at the beginning with the counterparty that his clients waive banking secrecy and their documentation can be shared with you who receives the letter. So you have to really check what is the case in which you are, and depending on it, you can perform a testing more or less frequently. But in general, the answer is yes, the CSSF expect some form of testing. You are free to organize it as you wish to do it. And it should be done in a risk-based approach, but not the same for everyone. Really target where you believe it makes sense to go testing.
So there are room for negotiation there when you agree on the wording in the AML letters regarding that. That's good to know for the other side. How do you see an AML statement published online on a client's website versus the signed and dated copy addressed to us? Do you feel comfortable downloading these from the website rather than asking for a signed copy from the relevant counterparty?
The document from the website of the company may be fairly acceptable if at the same time it is issued and signed by somebody who can represent the company rather than, and in that case, it has an equal value of receiving it through an email. And,
Thanks, Jerome. Have we missed any questions, Frank? You seem to be...
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. I think the fundamental question here is around GDPR, if I understand correctly, and to which extent the the underlying information you receive will be treated. Maybe to make a long story short, as soon as you get private information from investors, you are the data controller, naturally speaking. So as soon as you receive something, you're in control of the data, you're responsible for the data. Now comes a very good point about the TA. Isn't the TA also a data controller? And the answer is, I believe that yes. And there was an opinion issued by the European Privacy Board, and maybe Jerome, you can summarize it better.
Yeah, it's European Data Protection Board.
Data Protection Board, yeah.
And it's a paper, actually a good one, which actually reopen the question of not splitting the world into data processor and data controller, where we know that the transfer agent have made themselves usually a data processor only, but open the question of joint controller. And it depends on the feature. And in particular, when you have AML processes, decision about the systems and the processes which are on that, you have a background to maybe have another thought about the role of the transfer agent, not only as a data processor, but as a joint controller, which may not please the transfer agent, but it is a question on the table.
There are some cases where the TA is clearly a controller, for instance, in the case of the so-called master KYC files, where they decide, how to share data. Even if the data is public, it's still, it's very often personal data involved. And so they are clearly
and even more when the transfer agent say impose in brackets or suggest strongly to each of its clients to adopt its own AML framework and classification, across the line.
The statement that you talked about now, Jerome, maybe we can share that afterwards in case anyone is interested in reading about this. I think that we have covered a lot of things, and of course we spoke more than 30 minutes. We normally do. If you have additional questions, please send them to us. We are very interested in continuing this discussion. And the goal is, of course, to make everybody use the AML comfort letters in the right situations and minimizing work related to them, but still making everybody comfortable with these commitment letters. So thanks, Frank and Jerome, and look forward to seeing you all sometime soon.
Thank you very much to everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.